March 1974. Deep in the Philippine jungle on Lubang Island, a Japanese soldier emerges from the dense vegetation. He's wearing a tattered Imperial Army uniform. His rifle is meticulously maintained, though decades old. His sword still gleams. His name is Lieutenant Hio Onoda, and he's been fighting World War II for 29 years after it ended. He doesn't know that Japan surrendered in 1945. Or rather, he doesn't believe it. For nearly 3 decades, he's conducted guerrilla warfare against an enemy that no longer exists, killed civilians he believed were enemy combatants, and survived in conditions that would break most men. This isn't a story about a soldier who got lost. This is a story about a man so devoted to duty, so indoctrinated by the samurai code, that he literally could not accept that his war was over, even when they dropped leaflets telling him, even when his own family begged him to come home, even when former comrades were sent to find him. He kept fighting. For 29 years, tonight, I'm going to tell you the complete, documented story of Hio Onoda, the last Japanese soldier to surrender after World War II. How he survived. Why he kept fighting. The people who died because of his refusal to accept reality. And the strange, troubling hero's welcome he received when he finally came home. If you're fascinated by untold stories of human endurance, by the psychology of extreme belief, by the dark side of loyalty taken to its absolute limit, subscribe and hit that notification bell. This is history that challenges everything you think you know about duty and honor. Let's go back to 1944, when a young intelligence officer received orders that would define the rest of his life. Hio Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in Kamikawa, Japan. He came of age in the 1930s, as Japanese militarism reached its peak. The samurai code, Bushido, wasn't just history. It was alive, embedded in every aspect of Japanese military culture. 3 principles defined Bushido: loyalty to the emperor above all else, acceptance of death without fear, and never surrendering under any circumstances. Surrender was worse than death. It was eternal shame. By 1942, Onoda had been conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was 20 years old, intelligent, and observant. These qualities caught the attention of his superiors, who selected him for specialized training. In 1944, Onoda was sent to the Nakano School, an elite intelligence academy that trained officers in guerrilla warfare, espionage, and survival techniques. This wasn't conventional military training. Nakano graduates were taught to operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods. They were trained to distrust information, to assume deception, to rely only on orders from verified superiors, and they were taught that the mission comes before everything. Before comfort, before safety, before life itself. Onoda excelled. By late 1944, as Japan's strategic situation became desperate, he received his assignment, Lubang Island in the Philippines. His mission was to conduct guerrilla operations, gather intelligence, and under no circumstances allow the enemy to use the island's airstrip or harbor. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him specific instructions that would haunt the next 3 decades. According to Onoda's later testimony, Taniguchi told him, "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily." Those orders, to never surrender, to wait for retrieval, to continue the mission indefinitely, became Onoda's scripture. His absolute truth. In December 1944, Lieutenant Hio Onoda, age 22, arrived on Lubang Island with a small group of soldiers. The island was about 25 miles long, covered in dense jungle and mountains, with a population of several thousand Filipino civilians. Within months, everything changed. American forces invaded the Philippines, overwhelming Japanese defenders. By February 1945, US troops landed on Lubang. The small Japanese garrison was quickly defeated or scattered. Most Japanese soldiers on Lubang surrendered or were killed. A few, including Onoda and 3 others, retreated into the jungle interior. They would become guerrilla fighters, operating from the dense forest, living off the land, conducting raids. They believed they were still following orders, that reinforcements would come, that Japan would win. In August 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally. World War II ended, but in the jungles of Lubang, for Japanese soldiers didn't know that. Or more precisely, they would refuse to believe it. The 4 holdouts who retreated into Lubang's jungle in early 1945 were Lieutenant Hyo Onoda, the ranking officer, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private Kinshichi Kazuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. Their initial mission, disrupting enemy use of the airstrip, became irrelevant within weeks. American forces secured the island and moved on. The war shifted elsewhere. But Onoda's group didn't know this. Cut off from all communication, they believed they were still in an active combat zone. They established a base camp deep in the jungle, in mountainous terrain that was nearly inaccessible. Onoda imposed strict military discipline. They maintained a watch schedule, kept their weapons clean and functional, conducted reconnaissance patrols, and survived. Survival meant theft. They raided local farms for food, rice, bananas, coconuts. They killed the occasional cow for meat. From the perspective of Filipino civilians, these weren't soldiers anymore. They were dangerous bandits terrorizing the countryside. In October 1945, 2 months after Japan's surrender, the first leaflets were dropped on Lubang. Printed by American occupation forces, they announced Japan's surrender and instructed remaining Japanese soldiers to come out of hiding. Onoda's group found the leaflets, read them carefully, and dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Their reasoning made sense from their perspective. Psychological warfare was a known tactic. The enemy would naturally try to trick them into surrendering by claiming the war was over. This was exactly what Nakano school training warned them about. Trust nothing, verify everything, assume deception. More leaflets followed. Newspapers were left at locations where the holdouts might find them, showing post-war Japan. Family letters were dropped, begging them to come home. None of it worked. Onoda later explained his thinking. Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I had to follow my orders as I did not want to become a prisoner of war. The tragic irony was that his training made him impossible to reach. He'd been too well taught to distrust enemy information. By 1949, for years after the war ended, one of the group couldn't take it anymore. Private Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest, slipped away one night and surrendered to Filipino authorities. He was repatriated to Japan, where he confirmed that Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka were still in the jungle. Japan sent search parties. Onoda's own brother traveled to Lubang with a loudspeaker, broadcasting messages. Family photographs were left in the jungle with personal notes. Official documents from the Japanese government were delivered. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka observed these efforts from hiding, and concluded they were elaborate tricks. The voices could be recorded. The documents could be forged. The photographs could be faked. Everything could be deception. Their isolation had become psychological as much as physical. They'd created an alternative reality where the war never ended, where Japan still fought, where their mission still mattered, and people were dying because of it. Between 1945 and 1974, Onoda's group conducted numerous raids on Filipino settlements. They burned rice stores they believed were intended for enemy forces. They shot at farmers they thought were enemy soldiers. They killed civilians they perceived as threats. The exact death toll is disputed. Philippine authorities documented at least 30 deaths attributable to the holdouts' actions over the years. Some sources claim more. Each death was a tragedy. Innocent people killed by soldiers fighting a war that had ended decades earlier. In 1954, Corporal Shimada was killed in a shootout with Philippine police. It had been 9 years since the war ended. Now only Onoda and Kozuka remained. They continued for 18 more years. The two men developed a routine that kept them alive and maintained their military bearing. They moved camp regularly, never staying in one location more than a few days. They hid supplies in multiple cache points throughout the jungle. They maintained their uniforms and equipment with obsessive care. Onoda enforced discipline as if they were still an operational military unit. Daily inspections, weapons maintenance, physical training, intelligence gathering through reconnaissance. They'd been in the jungle for so long that they'd become part of it. They knew every trail, every water source, every hiding spot. But they were also slowly going mad from isolation and purpose without meaning. In 1972, 27 years after the war ended, Private Kozuka was killed in a firefight with Philippine police during a raid on a farm. The police had been alerted to suspicious activity. When they confronted the raiders, shooting broke out. Kozuka was shot and died on the scene. The Philippine police found his body and were shocked. A Japanese soldier, still in uniform, decades after the war. Investigation revealed his identity. The incident made international news. Now Hio Onoda was alone. The last Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. Age 50. 27 years in the jungle. And still refusing to surrender. The Japanese government launched a new search operation. They sent search parties with loudspeakers. They dropped more leaflets, including personal messages from Onoda's family and official surrender orders from the Japanese government. Onoda watched from a jungle and stayed hidden. He'd been alone before, brief separations from his comrades during operations. But this was different. Kozuka had been his companion for 18 years. Now there was only silence and his own thoughts. A lesser man would have broken, would have walked out of the jungle, surrendered, gone home. But Onoda had been shaped by training and ideology into something that couldn't bend. His sense of duty had calcified into obsession. He literally could not imagine disobeying orders, even orders given 28 years earlier by an officer who was probably dead. He kept his routine, maintained his weapons, conducted patrols, waited for orders that would never come until a young Japanese adventurer decided to find him. Norio Suzuki was 24 years old, a college dropout and adventurer who decided to travel the world in search of three things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda. He'd found the panda in a zoo. The snowman remained elusive. But in February 1974, he decided to try for Onoda. Armed with nothing but camping equipment and determination, Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island. He didn't bring a search party or military support. He just started hiking into the jungle, calling out, "Onoda-san, Japan needs you. The war is over. Please come out." Most people thought he was crazy. The Philippine government had conducted dozens of searches. The Japanese military had sent trained teams. All had failed. What could one college dropout possibly accomplish? But Suzuki had something the others didn't. He wasn't authority. He wasn't military. He wasn't trying to trick or capture Onoda. He was just a kid looking for adventure. And somehow, that made him less threatening after 4 days in the jungle. Sleeping rough and calling out regularly, Suzuki's persistence paid off. On February 20th, 1974, he encountered Hio Onoda face to face. Onoda later described the moment. He'd been observing this strange young man for days, listening to him call out. The kid was clearly not military, not a threat. Finally, curiosity overcame caution. Onoda stepped out of the jungle, rifle ready, and confronted Suzuki. The conversation that followed was surreal. Here was a 24-year-old in jeans and a t-shirt, talking to a 52-year-old soldier in a ragged World War II uniform, trying to explain that the war had been over for 29 years. Suzuki, the war ended in 1945. Japan surrendered. We lost. You can come home now. Onoda, I don't believe you. Show me proof. Suzuki showed him newspapers, photographs, documents. Onoda examined them with an intelligence officer's eye and dismissed most as potentially forged propaganda. But something in this kid's earnestness got through. They talked for hours. Suzuki promised to return with someone Onoda would believe, his former commanding officer, Major Taniguchi. The man who'd given the original orders in 1944. Onoda agreed to this condition. If Major Taniguchi orders me to surrender, I will obey. But only him. He gave me my orders. Only he can rescind them. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs proving he'd found Onoda. The images shocked the world. A ghost from World War II. Still in uniform, still armed, still fighting. The Japanese government faced a problem. Major Taniguchi was alive, now in his 70s and working as a bookseller in a quiet town. He'd long ago left the military. But if he was willing, he could formally release Onoda from his orders. Taniguchi agreed. On March 9, 1974, he traveled to Lubang Island with Japanese government officials and Suzuki. The meeting location was carefully chosen. A clearing in the jungle where Onoda felt safe enough to reveal himself, but authorities could witness the surrender. Philippine and Japanese officials waited at a distance. Suzuki went ahead with Taniguchi. Onoda emerged from the jungle in full uniform, his sword at his side, his rifle slung across his back. He stood at attention before his former commanding officer. Taniguchi read the official order, "Lieutenant Onoda, I am hereby relieving you of all military duties. All combat activity is to cease immediately. You are to surrender your weapons and return with us to Japan. This is a direct order. For a long moment, Onoda stood frozen. 29 years of waiting for these exact words. 29 years of discipline, of duty, of refusing to surrender. And now, finally, someone with legitimate authority was telling him the war was over. Tears ran down Onoda's weathered face. He bowed deeply. "I respectfully obey your orders." He began removing his equipment piece by piece. His rifle, an Arisaka Type 99, still functional after 3 decades. 500 rounds of ammunition, carefully preserved. Several hand grenades. His sword. Maps he'd meticulously maintained. His diary, documenting nearly 3 decades of solitary war. He laid it all out with military precision, each item carefully placed. Then he stood at attention one final time as a Japanese soldier and formally surrendered. The date was March 9, 1974. Hio Onoda had just ended his personal World War II, 10,556 days after it actually concluded. But the story doesn't end with surrender. What happened next revealed something profound about human psychology, national identity, and the cost of absolute loyalty. When Hio Onoda stepped out of the Philippine jungle after 29 years, he expected to face punishment. He'd killed people. He'd violated Philippine law. By any reasonable measure, he was a criminal. Instead, he received a hero's welcome. The Japanese government negotiated with Philippine authorities for Onoda's release without prosecution. President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon, citing the extraordinary circumstances and Onoda's genuine belief he was following orders. This decision outraged many Filipinos whose family members had been killed by Onoda's actions. To them, he was a murderer hiding behind duty as an excuse. Protests erupted. The families of victims demanded justice, but geopolitically, the Philippines and Japan needed to maintain good relations. Marcos decided that pardoning one old soldier was worth preserving diplomatic ties. The deal was done. On March 12, 1974, Onoda flew to Manila, then to Tokyo. When his plane landed at Haneda Airport, thousands of people were waiting. Media from around the world had descended on Tokyo to witness the return of the last Japanese soldier. Onoda descended the stairs in his old uniform, now cleaned and pressed. The crowd erupted in cheers. He was mobbed by reporters, photographers, well-wishers. People were crying, reaching out to touch him. This was 1974. Japan had been rebuilt into an economic powerhouse. The country had transformed from militaristic empire to pacifist democracy. The young generation had no memory of the war. They saw Onoda not as a soldier from a discredited regime, but as a symbol of dedication, loyalty, and Japanese endurance. He became an instant celebrity. His first press conference was watched by millions. Publishers competed for rights to his autobiography. Companies wanted him for endorsements. He received thousands of letters, some praising his loyalty, others condemning his actions, many simply expressing amazement that he'd survived. The Japanese government awarded him 30,000 yen in back pay for his 29 years of service. It was a pittance, but symbolically important. They were honoring his service, acknowledging that in his mind, he'd never stopped being a soldier on active duty. But Onoda struggled to adjust to the Japan he'd returned to. Everything was different. The country he remembered from 1944 no longer existed. The militaristic society that had shaped him had been thoroughly rejected and rebuilt. In interviews, he expressed shock at modern Japan, the materialism, the peace constitution that forbade military aggression, young people's attitudes toward authority and tradition. He'd come back to a world where the values that had defined him were considered dangerous relics. He wrote in his autobiography, "I had been prepared to die for my country. That was my duty. But when I came back, I found that Japan didn't need my sacrifice. They didn't want it. They'd moved on without me." The psychological adjustment was brutal. For 3 decades, his entire existence had purpose: fulfill the mission, maintain discipline, survive to serve the emperor. Now there was no mission, no war, no enemy, just a confusing modern world where his sacrifices seemed meaningless. Many expected him to retreat from public life, perhaps live quietly on government support. Instead, Onoda decided to keep moving forward. Though in a direction few anticipated. In 1975, he published his autobiography, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. It became a bestseller in Japan, translated into multiple languages. The book offered his perspective, not an apology, but an explanation. He'd followed orders. He'd done his duty. In his moral framework, he'd done nothing wrong, but reading between the lines, there's pain. He wrote about the isolation, the fear, the gradual realization that perhaps he'd made a terrible mistake. He acknowledged the people he'd killed, though he framed it as the inevitable cost of war. You can sense him struggling with the gap between the soldier he'd tried to be and the person he'd become. In 1976, Onoda did something unexpected. He moved to Brazil and became a cattle rancher. He married, raised a family, and built a new life far from Japan's media spotlight. Why Brazil? He later explained that Brazil reminded him of the jungle. Wild, undeveloped, challenging. He could work with his hands, live simply, avoid the chaos of modern Japanese society. But he couldn't completely leave his past behind. In 1984, he returned to Japan and established a nature school for young people, teaching survival skills, self-discipline, and traditional Japanese values. He wanted to pass on something of the old ways, the code he'd lived by, but adapted for a peaceful era. Critics accused him of glorifying militarism. Supporters praised him for teaching resilience and self-reliance. Onoda himself seemed conflicted about what exactly he was trying to preserve. In 1996, he did something remarkable. He returned to Lubang Island and donated $10,000 to the local school. He met with some of the families whose relatives had been killed by his actions. The meetings were tense, painful. Some families forgave him. Others never could. Onoda bowed deeply to them and said, "I am sorry for the trouble I caused. I was a soldier following orders, but I understand that doesn't erase the pain." It wasn't really an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Perhaps that was all he was capable of. Hio Onoda lived to age 91. He died on January 16, 2014, in Tokyo from heart failure. His death made international news. Obituaries struggled with how to characterize him: hero or war criminal, dedicated soldier or dangerous fanatic, symbol of loyalty or cautionary tale about blind obedience. Perhaps he was all of these things. The story of Hio Onoda raises uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. Was he a hero? From one perspective, yes. He exhibited extraordinary survival skills, maintained discipline for decades in brutal conditions, and remained absolutely loyal to his orders. These are admirable qualities, but 30 people died because of his actions. Families were devastated. Terror haunted Lubang Island for decades. Can duty excuse that? The Philippine perspective is clear. Onoda was a killer who evaded justice because of diplomatic convenience. The pardon was political expediency, not moral absolution. The victims' families received no compensation, no real acknowledgement of their suffering. The Japanese perspective is more complicated. Many saw Onoda as a last samurai, embodying traditional virtues in a world that had abandoned them. Others viewed him as an embarrassing reminder of Japan's militaristic past. Younger generations mostly just found him baffling. Why couldn't he accept that the war was over? Psychologists who studied Onoda's case identified several factors that enabled his decades-long delusion. First, his elite military training specifically taught him to distrust apparent surrender offers as enemy tricks. The better his training, the less reachable he became. Second, confirmation bias. Every piece of evidence that contradicted his worldview was dismissed as forgery. Every small event that could be interpreted as supporting his beliefs was amplified. Third, sunk cost fallacy. The longer he stayed in the jungle, the harder it became to admit he might be wrong. Admitting the war was over would mean acknowledging that he'd wasted decades, killed people for nothing. Fourth, identity. His entire sense of self was built around being a soldier on a mission. Accepting that the war had ended meant accepting that his core identity was obsolete. But perhaps the deepest insight comes from examining what happened after his surrender. When Onoda returned to Japan and saw what it had become, he was horrified. The values he'd lived by, self-sacrifice, hierarchy, militarism, had been rejected. In some way, staying in the jungle made sense to him. The outside world had become more alien than the jungle. At least in the jungle, his worldview was consistent. He was a soldier. He had orders. He had purpose. Onoda's story also reveals something about the nature of belief. Once someone is sufficiently convinced of something, evidence becomes irrelevant. He didn't refuse to believe the war was over because he was stupid. He refused because accepting it would destroy everything he'd built his life around. This pattern appears throughout history and in modern times. Political extremists who can't accept election results. Conspiracy theorists who dismiss all contradictory evidence as part of the conspiracy. True believers of any ideology who've invested too much to ever change their minds. Onoda was an extreme case, but the psychological mechanism is universal. There's also the question of responsibility. Onoda claimed he was following orders. But at what point does following orders become a choice? He had many opportunities to surrender. He chose not to. People died because of that choice. The Nuremberg trials established that following orders is not a valid defense for war crimes. But Onoda wasn't tried. He was pardoned. Does that make it right? What about Major Taniguchi, the officer who gave those original orders? He lived quietly for decades, apparently unburdened by guilt over what his orders had caused. Should he bear responsibility? These questions don't have clear answers. That's what makes Onoda's story so unsettling. It's not a simple tale of heroism or villainy. It's a complex examination of duty, belief, and the human cost of ideology taken to its extreme. Onoda's legacy in Japan remains contested. Some schools teach his story as an example of dedication. Others use it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience. He's been the subject of books, documentaries, and films, each interpreting his story differently. In the Philippines, his legacy is clearer. He's remembered as a terrorist whose victims were forgotten in the rush to celebrate his dedication. Perhaps the most important lesson from Hio Onoda's story is this: duty without judgment becomes fanaticism. Loyalty without reason becomes slavery. And believing so strongly that you can't accept evidence to the contrary is not strength. It's a kind of madness. Onoda survived 30 years in the jungle. But in some ways, he never really came home. The world had moved on without him, and he spent his remaining years trying to find purpose in a reality he no longer understood. He was the last Japanese soldier to surrender after World War II. And in many ways, he was also one of its last casualties. Hio Onoda died in 2014 at age 91. His funeral was attended by thousands. Veterans saluted. The media called him the last samurai. And on Lubang Island, where he'd spent nearly 3 decades, the memories of his victims quietly faded from public consciousness. His story remains one of the most extraordinary tales of human endurance and one of the most troubling examples of how training, ideology, and circumstances can turn a man into something both admirable and monstrous. He was a soldier who never surrendered, a man who kept his word even when it cost lives, a symbol of loyalty that crossed the line into fanaticism. History will debate forever whether Hio Onoda was a hero or a war criminal. The truth, uncomfortable as it may be, is that he was both, and neither. He was a man who believed so completely in his duty that he couldn't see when that duty had become meaningless, who fought with dedication for a cause that no longer existed, who killed for an empire that had already died. If this story of extreme belief, survival against impossible odds, and the dark side of unwavering loyalty moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Leave a comment. Do you think Onoda was a hero, or should he have been prosecuted? And share this with anyone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Because the most fascinating stories are the ones that make us question what we believe about duty, honor, and when loyalty becomes too much. Thanks for watching.